Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. Over the last day or two, I've been tackling a very, very interesting proposition, which is if you and your wife are at the same event, are you allowed to go and see each other speak? So my wife is sitting in the front row here. This is a very unusual thing. It may make this the most difficult talk I've ever given, in fact. So today, in the next 20 minutes, I'd like to offer a very, very simple proposition. And over the next 20 minutes, I'd simply like to flesh that out. And that proposition is the following, that in the future, if you're not a learning organization, you won't be a living one. And so over the next 20 minutes, I'm going to tackle this proposition. But the central thesis is that in nearly every organization, you're only as good as your people and the sum total of their capabilities. And if someone else has better leaders, better skills for the new economy, and better ways of working together, they're going to have the edge. And so if as an organization you're not constantly learning, don't expect any longer to be the industry leader. Don't expect to be the innovator in your industry. Don't expect to be able to attract talent or to hold on to it. So today I'd like to talk a little bit about where we are with corporate learning. And actually, what do we mean when we talk about corporate learning? It's kind of a simple two-word phrase, but I think there's a lot that we could unpack there. And then what might corporate learning look like in the future? And where are we going to go from here? So let me just illustrate the scale of the challenge by offering up the context in which companies today are operating. Companies, as we all know, are more global. They're more matrixed. Their supply chains span dozens of countries. Their regulatory environments are very complex. Their talent pools are global. They're dealing with macroeconomic and industry volatility. They're being disrupted by new players from all around the world, from places you don't expect them. And then, of course, there's that whole shift to digital thing that they're dealing with, which is pretty much upending their core business processes and their customer relationships. So when looked at this way, the scale of the challenge is actually quite unprecedented. And maybe one way to bring it to life is to bring an example that's been well talked about in the press lately, but that's the example of AT&T, which was recently talked about in a very interesting New York Times article, which you should all read. But as the New York Times noted, just not that long ago, AT&T had to compete with first phone companies, later with wireless companies. It managed copper wires, and it managed cell phone towers. But then the internet and cloud computing happened in a pretty significant way, and now it's actually tussling with Amazon or Google or Netflix. These are the new competitors. So think about this. It now has 280,000 people, and it needs to prepare many of them to learn to code, to learn consumer-centric design, data science, to deal with the fire hose of data it's getting. So imagine that. Imagine the challenge of changing and improving the skills of 280,000 people while someone else is trying to take your business. Like, this is not corporate learning as we've historically thought about. The scale of that change is absolutely tremendous. And AT&T is not alone. It's my thesis that over the next 10 or 20 years, we're going to see hundreds of companies worldwide embark on capability building programs of that scale. And that's absolutely unprecedented. So I think it's in that context why corporate learning, as we know it, needs to be reinvented. And it's sort of the reason why corporate learning will be more important than ever before. So perhaps let's start with some facts. And let's look at a few specific challenges that companies are facing that bring more data to this situation. So in work we've done, 40% of employers say that a skills shortage is driving entry-level vacancies. Second, they're saying they can't fill jobs. In the US alone, there are 5.8 million job vacancies. So it means the labor market is not working in some way. Third, I would argue there's a massive gap between the leadership we need and the leadership we've got. That's a tremendous global learning deficit. And finally, they're struggling with this very sobering fact. We don't actually know what works in corporate learning. It reminds me of the advertising adage that we know that 50% of our advertising works, we just don't know what 50% it is. And I think we face the same problem in corporate learning. Now, even though we don't necessarily know what works, there's no doubt that we have to invest. Let's just take one small part of corporate learning. A big piece of what we focus on is leadership and leadership development. Our research shows some pretty interesting things, that there's a very substantial premium for investing in leadership. We think that those performing in the top quartile of leadership, on average, outperform others by 2 times on EBITDA. 2 times from being in the top quartile in leadership performance. That if you invest significantly in developing leaders, you're 2.4 times more likely to hit your performance targets. And that if you have what we call centered leadership capabilities, you're 4 times as likely to be able to lead amongst change, and nearly all of us are leading amongst change. And so, taking just a few of these facts and threading them together, it's created what you might say is a pretty big opportunity. $130 billion market was the market for global corporate training in about 2013. And to put that in perspective, the consumer market for training was only about $25 billion. Now, where is this opportunity? It's pretty interesting to know that most of it's in the US. So the US alone is a $70 billion opportunity. And how fast is this growing? Our research suggests it's growing by about 15%. 15% on a $70 billion market. And the pace of change is just accelerating. So before we go any further, it's worth asking, when we talk about corporate learning, what exactly do we mean? So I want to offer up that when we talk about corporate learning, firstly, we're talking about many different targets. The first are what I'd broadly call the generals. These are the leaders and managers of institutions. In some cases, it's measured in the hundreds of people, but in vast global enterprises, it's measured in tens of thousands of people. The second I might broadly categorize as the technicians. And by that I mean the people with specific capabilities, specific functional knowledge. These are the supply chain experts, the people doing pharmaceutical R&D, the finance people, the sales and marketing people, the people expert in social media and marketing, the programmers and so on, but people with deep functional capabilities. The third set of people I think we need to be talking about are the frontline. And by that we mean the customer service reps, the retail associates, the sales force. They're the people who fundamentally are responsible for the experience that people have of your company. And finally, I think it's very important to include the pipeline. It's not just the people in your company, but it's the people who one day might be in your company. And one of the interesting things about this is our view about the pipeline has to expand pretty dramatically. If you think, for example, about the specific problem of getting women in engineering, that pipeline problem, you need to go all the way back to middle school to solve that. So Facebook, in tackling this issue, is actually going back to middle school, and that's what a whole lot of other companies are doing. So I think when we talk about corporate learning, we're talking about 4 targets: the generals, the technicians, the frontline, and the pipeline. So what do we mean when we're talking about the corporate learning system? Well, I would argue when we're talking about the corporate learning system, we're talking about the integrated system that delivers the people, capabilities, and the culture to win. And I think it's very important that culture is included in that. And I would say the integrated system has several components. First is, I would say, it's the current employee graph, which in my mind is the very granular inventory of who do you have and what can they do. The second is you need to have a clear point of view about the future employee graph. Or if we move to sports, you might want to say you want to know where the puck is going. You need to know exactly where your company is headed, where your industry is headed, what skills do you need, and at what level of granularity do you need them. So you need a really specific view about where you're headed. The third element of the corporate learning system, I would say, is the overall learning architecture. It's your view about who needs to learn what, when they need to learn it, and how they're going to learn it. And finally, you need, fourthly, you need the programs that are connected to work. These are the courses, the field work, the projects, and how they're relevant to the work that people do. And finally, and this is the thing I want to start emphasizing much more, we need a much tighter integration between corporate learning and the business. Said another way, we need to prove that it drives business performance. Because without that, we'll have the current levels of investment we've got. I mean, how many times has anyone been in a conversation where someone has challenged you on the amount you invest in professional development? And it's because we don't have a robust enough connection to business performance. So with that background, what I'd like to do is offer a perspective on what corporate learning might look like in the future. So why don't we do the following? I'd actually like to just move to the year 2025. So my favorite movie is Back to the Future. So let's imagine we're getting in the DeLorean now. This speech is part of my pitch to my wife to let me buy an old DeLorean, I would say. But let's go to the future. And what I'd like to do is share 10 provocative propositions about the future. So let's go to a few different places around the world. Let's first go to Detroit, Michigan, and let's visit Chloe. Chloe is the CEO of an automotive company, and there happen to be a few of them in Detroit. But Chloe's facing a pretty different world. She's facing a world in 2025 in which Tesla is the #1 automotive manufacturer. So she's got a very different situation, and she realizes, and she's been realizing for a while, that she doesn't run a car company, she runs a mobility company. And a mobility company needs a whole different set of capabilities. It needs to know much more about electric vehicles, autonomous driving, changing trends in urbanization and mobility. She needs urban planners. Today's car alone, today's average high-end car alone, has 7 times the code of a Boeing 787, an average high-end car. So the question on her mind is, do her workers have the necessary data science skills, machine learning, design thinking, mechatronics, coding skills necessary to innovate the car and mobility of the future? So what Chloe is in the middle of in 2025 is similar to the thing I mentioned to you before about AT&T. She's embarked on a top-to-bottom retooling of the skills of the entire 200,000 people in her organization. And the consequences of not doing so are basically obsolescence and irrelevance. Which brings me to my first proposition about the future of corporate learning, which is that in the future, CEOs will need to turn the Titanic in order to avoid its fate. In other words, CEOs will need to take their companies, their massive global companies, and rebuild them organization-wide, top to bottom. And the real implication of this proposition is, how do you think about the problem when you're thinking about reskilling 200,000 people in 5 years? That's an absolutely staggering problem. And if you put that in perspective, Stanford has 7,000 undergraduates. Just think about the scale of that change. Now I'd like to go somewhere else. I'd like to visit, let's go to Munich. Let's visit Jens, who's the CEO of another company. Jens is the CEO of an industrial conglomerate. That conglomerate has 12 businesses. It operates in 65 countries. It manages a vendor and partner network of 3,500 other companies. And one of the things he realizes is that collectively he has this leadership deficit I talked about, that his leaders and managers lack the leadership skills to manage the company with agility and to create the required culture of innovation. So he decides he needs a leadership program. So what he starts doing is he starts cataloging the top people in his company. He starts listing them all out. Who are the people who I need to develop? And pretty soon, working together with his global head of HR, that list out of 30,000 employees or so is actually 3,000 people. Today's companies often think of, I have to build the capabilities of the top 300. In the future, it's going to be more like the top 3,000. And he thinks back to the time when GE, Jack Welch, and others talked about the top 300. And what he realized is he's created this flat hierarchical structure, which is more agile and which he's empowered more people. But look at the mess he's got himself into. He's got to build the capabilities of 3,000 leaders. So that brings me to my second proposition, which is that in the future, 3,000 will be the new 300 when you think about leadership capabilities. And so the real question this raises is, how do you embed leadership skills at a scale that you haven't thought about in the past? Now let's come back to the US and go to Dallas, Texas, and we'll visit John, who's the CLO of a telecommunications company. And John finds himself in a position where the range of skills and capabilities in his telco has changed by, let's say, a factor of 5. He needs skills with digital, engineering, data science, network optimization at a level he hadn't had before, design thinking, multi-channel customer service, and he finds himself now basically running a small payments company because he's dealing with microtransactions with his customers in all sorts of different ways. So that's what he faces, and he realizes he can't just have a program for a small set of people anymore. He can't just deal with leaders and high performers. I'm going to go back. He can't just deal with programs for leaders and high performers. And he's got to deal with the fact that there are new delivery modalities. And he has to select the right ones based on who you are and how you learn and what access to technology you've got. He realizes some people have a different work rhythm than other people. And what's more, he sees that in nearly every area where he wants to deliver learning, there's somebody else who could deliver it better than he could. He is no longer in any area best of breed. He might go to Stanford for design thinking, General Assembly for data science, McKinsey for leadership and strategy. So this is a very different world in which he operates, and he realizes he just can't build fast enough to meet the needs as they're changing. So he realizes that in the end, he needs to be the orchestrator of change, the creator of an organization-wide learning ecosystem that basically is fully open. So that brings me to the third proposition, which is to succeed in the global economy, companies will need to deliver learning from everywhere for everyone. So imagine that in the future you have to deliver perhaps 500 or more programs given the granularity of skills you need. Those programs might be delivered by 50 organizations to reach 100,000 people. Again, you'll see this small theme of scale. I'd now like to go to Middlesex in the UK. And let's visit Cynthia, who's the Chief Learning Officer of a global healthcare company. And that company is both a payer and a provider. So an insurance company and also a company that runs hospitals and primary care networks. Let me give you a sense of the challenge that she faces. She's got primary care physicians and nurses, academic researchers, hospital administrators, and hardware and software experts in the hospitals who are working on quantified self and population health. On the payer side, she's got payment experts, people working on payment innovation, people focused on insurance coverage, actuaries, machine learning experts, data science experts, customer service reps. So the scale of the different people and capabilities she's got is quite staggering. So she undertakes a global inventory of the capabilities she's got. And what she sort of realizes is the performance in variation she's got and capability she's got, not just across the organization, but within types of role, is quite incredible. And she has concluded that the only way to optimize the performance is to have personal learning journeys. She has to have learning on demand, she has to have different learning modalities, and she needs the infrastructure to support that. She needs a self-learning system that can adapt as people learn or stumble in different areas and meet them where they are. So my fourth proposition is that in the future, we're going to need pretty significant industrialized individual learning. So the question is, how do you drive personalized, adaptive, and digital learning at scale? So now let's come back, well, go to New York, which is my current hometown, and let's see the challenges that Michael faces. Michael is the global head of talent for a global asset management company. The company manages $3 trillion in assets. But there are some pretty significant problems in asset management and financial services in general. The return on equity is declining. The cost of asset management products is declining as it gets competed away and these products get commoditized. And there's increasing pressure to create an edge. So how do you create an edge? Well, this asset manager has decided that it's by focusing on building a more distinctive workforce, by investing in the capabilities of its people. And that happens to be an area where financial services companies historically underinvest. But as he talks with the leaders of this company, what Michael realizes is that the bar is pretty high on getting any investment. He can't free up any dollars in this environment. So he realizes he's going to need to show a direct connection between learning and business performance. It's not going to be enough to talk about how much did you enjoy a course? Would you recommend it to a colleague? Do you think you learned something? No, instead, there's going to need to be a pretty aggressive view about return on investment. There'll need to be direct and indirect correlations to business performance. Which brings me to my fourth proposition, which is that all learning in the future will need to be more evidence-based. And it raises a fundamental question, which is, will we find that some boards will start to demand and ask, what is your learning alpha? So imagine a new synthetic metric which tries to describe the value you create over and above the performance that your people have today. So think about that, learning alpha. So now I'd like to go to Kyoto in Japan, and let's visit Yumi. Yumi works as part of the frontline staff at a retailer in Kyoto. This is not her on the shop floor. She actually works in fast fashion. And one of the things about fashion is that staff cost is a pretty significant portion of overall costs, as is real estate. And floor staff have very high turnover, as you know. And they're not always good at solving customer problems when the turnover is very high. So there's a really significant need to train them. But how do you do that when you're faced with the problem of not being able to take your staff off the floor for training? Because if they're off the floor, they're not selling. So we're going to need to move to a world with much more real-time experiential learning. Think about using wearables as a mobile learning assistant. Think about a wearable monitoring your customer interaction in real time. Think about it giving you real-time feedback about the interaction you just had. And think about being able to look at it immediately after and it offering a suggestion for how you might handle the same event with your next customer, which is algorithmic based. And think about such a program which is proven directly to show a lift in customer satisfaction and revenue per interaction. That's the new kind of new experiential learning that will come to dominate corporate learning, which is my sixth proposition. And it really leads to the question, how do we put in place experiential learning systems where you learn today, apply today, and practice tomorrow to get better? So now I'd like to go to the American Midwest, and let's visit Rebecca in Cleveland, Ohio. She's the head of recruiting for an advanced manufacturing company. And she's been thinking hard about what's predictive in terms of success, in terms of getting people into the company. And what she starts to see is that some of the traditional factors, we all know what they are, including university background, are increasingly less predictive of success. She, of course, is looking at things like mindset-based factors like grit and resilience and conscientiousness. But she also starts to think about new ways to judge where people acquired their skills. And she starts to focus much more on where people have acquired their skills. She starts to say, for my marketing people, have they been to P&G? Have my machine learning people been trained by Netflix? Have my engineers worked at SpaceX or Waze? And it raised some pretty interesting questions about who is the new credentialer. Now, of course, there are all these labor market platforms which help her in this endeavor. She can go to LinkedIn. She can get granular level data on how people build capabilities from burning glass. So this brings me to my proposition, seventh proposition, which is that companies will become the new credentialers. So might you in the future go, as people already do, to McKinsey for strategy and leadership, Amazon and Google for design, for digital, and IDEO for design thinking. So let's make one of our last few visits. Let's go to Sydney, Australia, and see Lenny, who's a future business leader. And Lenny is a rising professional. He's 35 years old, manages a $100 million P&L and a team of 300. He faces very complex team dynamics. He travels a lot. He's got rapid growth. His company is subject to global commodity volatility, and so he's got volatile business performance. He's under incredible stress. And he is set up in a completely different way than how we think about leaders today. He spends a lot of his time focusing on nutrition, exercise, energy management, peak performance, tapering. He's got an executive coach that's helping him on prioritization and time management. He uses different methods for quantified self. He has a Fitbit which tracks his leadership style. He has other tech-enabled tools for personal performance. Lenny in the future, leaders in the future, will be training for peak performance like professional athletes. The stresses and pressures on them are just too great. Which brings me to my eighth proposition, which is that leaders of tomorrow will train for peak performance like athletes. Let's make one of our last stops in New Delhi in India, where we can visit Priya, who's a high performer who works in financial services. And the one thing that differentiates her is a completely new way of learning, which is she's learning metacognition skills. And the biggest thing she's learning is she's learning how to learn. And specifically, she's learning about present moment awareness. She's learning how to be above the fray in any given moment. how to understand and see what's going on, how to observe her own behavior and performance, and adjust her performance in real time. And unsurprisingly, this is a characteristic of many top athletes. But this includes things like mindfulness, the ability to understand your mindset in a moment, and have the presence and self-awareness to have, as I've described here, present moment awareness. So where does this all take us? I'm going to skip right to the end here and say, where does it all end up if we add this all up? I would offer the following agenda, which is, with corporate learning changing in this way, the only choice you have is to be bold, and you have to start with a clean sheet. You have to begin with your strategy. You have to understand your industry. You have to know where exactly your company is going, and you have to develop a comprehensive blueprint from the ground up about the capabilities you need, the skills you have, and understand and create a comprehensive learning architecture. And finally, you have to be thinking from the very beginning of, what am I creating as a CEO, a chief learning officer, or a head of talent? What is my learning alpha going to be? And how am I going to differentiate that from others to give myself the edge? And of course, like anybody in this modern environment, you're going to have to adjust and adjust repeatedly. So let me just end with my proposition again, which is that in the future, if you're not a learning organization, you won't be a living one. Thank you.